Hey everyone, this is a quick recap of the webinar we did for ECO-201 for Milestone 2. I'm going to go through with you the main points that we discussed in our webinar, and hopefully that will help get you started and finished on your Milestone 2. So the first thing we shared in the webinar was the rubric. This was just to remind everybody that this is how you'll be graded in the elements to include. So the first part of the rubric are the elements that you'll need to include, which are listed here. There are two sections. The first section is on supply and demand conditions. The second section is on price elasticity of demand. And you'll see here they're numbered 2 and 3. This is because they're sections 2 and 3 of your overall final paper. Section 1 was the section that you wrote in Milestone 1. So eventually you'll be putting all of this together. And each of these sections has some elements in them. So this section 2 here on supply and demand has got 2 elements, and the next section has 3 elements. And we discussed those further in the webinar about how to make sure you hit on each of these to make sure you get full credit. Now further on down the rubric is how you'll be scored. So you'll see the 5 content elements here. They're all scored equally. And you'll notice that there's a proficient column. Since this is a milestone, your instructor is only expecting you to be at the proficient level. For your final project, there is an exemplary level. So I always tell all my students to look at both. So even when you're writing your milestone, you should always have the end in mind. Even though you can still get full credit 100% by being proficient, on the final, being proficient will be about a B level. So if you want to make sure that your milestone is doing as much as it can, even looking towards the final project, I would look at that final project rubric and see what you can do to go above proficient in each of these categories and get into that exemplary column. But this is how you'll be scored for this assignment. And then the last element that you're scored on is articulation of response. So that's just your writing and your formatting of your paper. And that's worth 10 points, so a little bit less than each of the other elements that are content-based. So from there, we went to the actual guide. Now, this guide can work sort of as a template. If you want to work right within this document, it's shared in all of your classes in the final project resources. And since it's a Word document, you can use it and just start to put in your own information, your title, your name, or you can just use whatever document you're already using and just use this as a guide to read through and access. It's really up to you. So the first part that we discussed was the determinants of market demand. And we discussed how this is going to help you address this element on evaluate the trends in demand over time. So whatever kind of product or service your company sells, you want to look at demand over time, trends in demand over time for that product overall, and also start to look at it for that specific brand. So for instance, one student gave the example in the webinar last night of Ford Motor Company. That was the company that they had chosen to write about. So that would be the automobile industry. So you would look in trends in demand for the auto industry. And to do so, to see how demand is changing in that market, the market for automobiles, you would look at these determinants of market demand. So in our webinar, we took some time to discuss each of these items. And you can also link right here, link to this. This is a video from your textbook that also explains all of these determinants of market demand. But I'll go through them quickly. Income, obviously the more income a person has, the more things they can demand and the higher price they are willing to pay for things in general. Because they have more money. And the opposite would be true. The less money you have, the less demand there would be. The price of related goods, if a similar kind of good is available to you for a cheaper price, demand for the particular good will go down. If similar goods are higher in price, the demand for this particular good would go up. And then tastes, that's just what people are interested in right now, whether it's a fad or a long-standing preference in a population or in a country or in a region. Those things are really going to drive demand one way or the other, depending on what it is. So one example I'd like to share with students is Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola has had been part of a lot of bad publicity because there's been a lot of scientific research on the harm of the stuff that's in their soda, whether it's high fructose corn syrup or some of the chemicals that are in their drinks. So that changes people's tastes and preferences when they hear news like that about a product. Population and demographics. So population, just a population growing will automatically increase the demand. So if you have a restaurant in a town and the population of that town is growing, then demand for your product should go up. And demographics is if you are aimed at a certain group of people, like an age group or a race group or a culture group, and that group is growing or shrinking, that will affect demand for your product. In the US, that's really important with generational demographics, since the baby boomers are now getting older and retiring, and they're going to be in that elderly category. Products that service the elderly will see an increase in demand. So that's something that can be important depending on the product or service that you're investigating in your paper. And then lastly, expected future prices. We talked about if for some reason people expect the price of this good to go down in the future, they will buy less of it now because they'd rather wait until the price is cheaper. And then if the opposite would be true in the other way, if they expect the price to be higher in the future, then they'll buy it now and try to save some money with the cheaper price that's happening now. So this is generally, the expected future price is more applicable to expensive products, often durable goods, like a car, washing machine, things like that, that tend to last a long time, that you don't need to buy frequently. So you can time your purchase around what you expect the price to be at a certain time. It wouldn't be as applicable to something that you buy on a regular, ongoing, daily, monthly, weekly type basis. So that is the best way to make sure that you capture this element, this first element. And then we talked a little bit about the second element. The main point that students wanted to talk about here was how to find sales and revenue figures from the 10K. So I have a 10K, or it's also called an annual report, that I can share with you. The sample paper that's in the final project resources folder, that's just a student paper from a few terms back that we shared with you to show you an example of what a good student paper looks like. That was on Hershey. So I'm going to use the Hershey 10K annual report to show you where you can start off. So here is their 10K. Some are very plain looking like this. Some are a little bit fancier. For the suggested companies list, you should have access to all of the 2015 annual reports in the final project resource folder. If you chose a company outside of that, you should be able to find the annual report or the 10K from the investor section of your company's website. So once you're here, it is a little bit tricky to comprehend everything that's in here. So what I recommend for you to do is just casually take your time, stroll through the 10K, the annual report. You don't necessarily need to read everything. This very first part talks a lot about just the company in general. So you might want to just skim this to get a sense of what they're doing. So we can see here a little bit about Hershey's history. You might have included this kind of information in your Milestone one, so maybe you already know this. And then, in this one, it talks about their segments. So some companies separate their business by segments, and you might want to investigate those separately in terms of demand and supply, and then later on in terms of costs. It really depends on your company. So you can read a little bit about that in the beginning. And then usually they start to pivot to more of the complicated business things. So here you see business acquisitions, the stuff that we don't really need to get into because, again, we're just focusing on the products and the demand and supply of them. We're not really concerned about a lot of the formation of the company and some of that more legal, business legal type of stuff. So, and then once you get past this part, it usually goes into, so this is some more good stuff. Each 10K is different, but this is why it's important to just scroll through and see if you find anything that's important. So raw materials and pricing, that would be very applicable to supply. And then also competition might not be perfect for this section, but in upcoming sections of your paper, you'll want to talk about competitors in the market. And then there'll be a section on management. You don't need to worry about that. You also don't need to worry about stock price information. So you can skip over a lot of things that just for whatever reason they don't seem that they would be part of how they supply their products, and they don't seem to be part of what the demand looks like for the product. So again, corporate information and stock price information, you can skip through that. So that will be, so this is some more investor notes that you can just skip through. And eventually, and again, see, this is stock information that you don't need. This is about, dividends and price per share. So you can skip right through that. We don't really analyze that in this class. You will analyze that in future business classes. But we do want to find the table with net sales. So this is where you're going to get some data for the second part of your paper. The second part of the supply and demand section. So this is the revenue or net sales numbers for the past 5 years. So that's kind of the minimum we want you to look at is a 5-year period, that just so you can really see a trend. Even with 3 years, it might not be enough. So some 10Ks will have 5 years, some might not. You might need to go back and get some older annual reports to get a 5 years worth of data, but this one has it all. So you can take this information and you can put it in a graph, you can put it in a table, and put that in your own paper. You do not need for this, at this point, the rest of this information. The cost stuff will be analyzed on Milestone 3. But if it's just a simple graph that shows a bar graph or a table that shows these revenue, these sales numbers, that would be perfect for the data portion of this section of the paper. And then from here, they often discuss some important things about the outlook of the company after they talk about how their sales have been. So this is where they might include insights about why their sales went up or why their sales went down. So those are the points, the parts of the 10K that you'll want to focus on. And I would definitely skim the rest because there might be more information in there that will be helpful to you, especially for later parts of the paper. And now I'm going to pivot back to our guide. And we were able to get into a little bit of price elasticity of demand. The main takeaway here was that I want everybody to know that you are not required to do a price elasticity of demand calculation. Chances are that you don't have the data that you'll need to do the entire calculation. There are some instances where you might have all the data you need. I believe Netflix has some pretty robust information on customer reactions to price changes. So anyone who's doing Netflix, you might have access to all the pieces you need to do the price elasticity of demand formula, but most people won't. So what I suggested to the group was look for the price elasticity of demand for your product overall. So if you are doing Ford Motor Company, you would look for the price elasticity of demand for automobiles. That research is done by leading economists in the field. They use very sophisticated models and lots of consumer data that wouldn't be appropriate for us to do in an introductory course. So take advantage of that research that's already been done. And once you find the price elasticity of demand for your product overall, we know from our textbook that the brand price elasticity of demand is always going to be more elastic than the general price elasticity. So if the elasticity of demand for an automobile is, let's say, 2.5, that's over 1, so it's elastic demand. We know that a Ford automobile would be even more elastic than that. So that's how you would analyze information and data to justify the price elasticity of demand. So you might say, well, if 2.5 is the overall elasticity, I know Ford's is even higher than this. And that would be one way to answer this question. So a lot of your products should have that research out there. Another thing you can do is you can check out the way that they're priced. If they price themselves very close to competitors, that's an indication that demand is elastic.